H.P. Lovecraft's story, The Call of Cthulhu, begins with some stark memorial lines that reveal what not only the story is about, but Lovecraft's own viewpoint, perhaps, on the cosmos. He says, "The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents." And what do we see actually happening in this story? Some correlations that are taking place on the part of the narrator, who is bringing together threads of research, of accounts, having to do with this, whatever we want to call it, the old one, Cthulhu, a monster, a terrifying reality. And it's being put forth, you could say, to us, the readers. But of course, as we're going to see in the end, in a way that tells us, we should get rid of this knowledge. So a correlation has taken place within the story, and that is what is supposed to produce the horror. Now, as opposed to the narrator, we find that, he goes on, "We live on a placid island of ignorance." So most of the time, most of us human beings, when it comes to the rest of the cosmos, even our own human realities, we only know a tiny little bit of the island that we live on, and we probably don't even fully understand that. Do we understand ourselves? Do we understand our families, our neighbors, our co-workers? Not all that well. So we live largely in ignorance. And he says, in the midst of black seas of infinity, a cosmos that ultimately doesn't care about us, in which we're just tiny little blips. And he says, it was not meant that we should voyage far. Some people do indeed voyage, or they travel outside of their little island, they embark, and they may even come back, but their tales are probably not going to be given all that much credibility by the people who they return to. And so we're safe, you could say. Our minds are safe. And then he says, the sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little. So, we pursue our different forms of knowledge. And remember that Lovecraft is writing in a time when, there's been incredible progress for several hundred years, and it looks like, wow, we're going to actually potentially understand everything. We'll reach out to the stars. We'll understand the vast gulfs of time that this planet or the universe has been here. So, up until now, not too much trouble with that. And then he goes on and he says, someday the piecing together, the correlating of dissociated knowledge, right? So knowledge that we have actually attained, but which hasn't been connected up. The implications haven't been woven into a thread, will open up such terrifying vistas of reality. Now, it's worth dwelling on that for just a moment. So Lovecraft is not saying that even if we put together all of the sciences and other forms of human knowledge, that we are going to grasp the totality of reality, but we will certainly grasp a lot more than we do stuck on our little islands or doing our little sciences or inquiries or stuff like that. And it will literally be mind-blowing. Vistas, sort of sights. You could think about looking down from a height. You can see much further. You can't see everything, but you can see enough. And what you're going to see, according to this, will be horrifying, terror-inducing. It'll produce a kind of cosmic despair. So he talks about a dilemma that then we as human beings, perhaps individually or perhaps societally, will face. He says that will open up such terrifying vistas of reality, and our frightful position therein, we shall either go mad from the revelation, so human beings will be insane, we won't be rational anymore, and probably we won't be able to relate from the past to these people of the future, or we will flee from that deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age. Now, a dark age, meaning one without record keeping or very spotty record keeping, and presumably barbarism and superstition, which would return us back to our islands of ignorance. Right? So either we make sense of the cosmos, which drives us insane, or we retreat into our little safe cosmic cocoon. And so we can ask ourselves, all right, this is an interesting start, kind of an interesting, cool hypothesis. What is it like for us to actually know far more than we do and to correlate the different disparate ways in which we grasp information and make sense of it? What are we going to correlate? What are the mind's contents that we could bring together? And you'll notice that he begins, now this is a very interesting thing. So this is a character who is a scientist, who says at one point that he is, sticking with the materialism that he had. Here we go. My attitude was still one of absolute materialism, as I wish it still were, and I discounted with a most inexplicable perversity the coincidence of the dream notes and odd cuttings collected by Professor Angle, right? And Professor Angle is going to be the narrator's great uncle. So who does he talk about first, though? It's not actually scientists, except for mentioning them a little bit. He talks about theosophists. So there's a variety of different perspectives that are falling within this, theosophical spectrum, let's call it, not all of which agree with each other. And what do they have in common? They think that there is some great meaning and reality and experience behind what the world's myths and religions have brought forward. So he talks about theosophists guessing at the awesome grandeur of the cosmic cycle wherein our world and human race form transient incidents. They have hinted at strange survivals in terms which would freeze the blood if not masked by a bland optimism. And then he says, but it's not from them that there came the single glimpse of forbidden eons which chills me when I think of it and maddens me when I dream of it. That glimpse, like all dread glimpses of truth, flashed out from an accidental piecing together of separated things. And so we're going to come back to that. So theosophy is part of what he's talking about. He'll go on a little bit later and talk about how his great uncle included in his matters citations from theosophical books and magazines, notably W. Scott Eliot's Atlantis and the Lost Lemuria. The rest comments on long surviving secret societies and hidden cults. So that's another thing that we can turn from. Theosophical speculations, kind of interesting, useful, but they're speculations. What is anthropology? That's a science, have to tell us. So here we find that he's made passages to mythological and anthropological source books like Fraser's Golden Bough, a very popular book at the time, Miss Murray's Witch Cults in Western Europe, and they're very interested in what we nowadays call mental health or mental illness, what they would call alienists at the time. So you could say psychology also figures into this, and we're going to get to see that the main character, the narrator, imagines that this research that he's carrying out, sort of piggybacking off of what his uncle has done, could actually make his career as an anthropologist, if he can bring together, if he can correlate all the information on the cults of Cthulhu. So this is the lure that is drawing him in. So we've got theosophical speculation, we've got ancient cults and accounts, some of which are coming from anthropology. We should also mention there's a character, Castro, who we meet in the second part of the story, and I'm not going to go through everything that he says, but he winds up being a very important informant. Old Castro remembered bits of hideous legend that paled the speculations of theosophists and made man and the world seem recent and transient indeed. There had been eons when other things ruled on the earth, and they had great cities. Remains of them, he said, the deathless Chinamen had told him, were still to be found as cyclopean stones on islands in the Pacific. They all died vast epochs of time before man came, but there were arts which could revive them when the stars had come round again to the right positions in the cycle of eternity. They had indeed come themselves from the stars and brought their images with them. So, has Castro actually seen this? No, this is something that has been handed down, and so it could be turned into anthropological observations, but it's there as part of human societies that Castro is part of, which connects him to a much longer, far going beyond prehistoric human beings cult of the great old ones. Then we also have accounts from people's experiences, don't we? We get to see what Johansen has to say in a narrative. We have the inspector from New Orleans' account. We have kind of an account from the uncle of this connection that he has to a particularly imaginative young man, and we get to see all of these things being put together and correlated by the narrator. So the sciences, particularly anthropology, are providing us with some context. And interestingly, we could say that within this story itself, you're going to see Lovecraft in this particular tale and in many others talking about non-Euclidean geometry, which is, a recent development within the culture of its time. The geometry of the sunken city risen up is not right, or that within people's dreams as well. So some of those sciences include mathematics, physics, right? Not just human sciences like psychology and anthropology. So those are the things that are being correlated within this story, in a very summary way, of course. And now we come to the main character, the narrator, who doesn't really act, right? He reports, he correlates, he suggests things to us. He is Professor Engel's grandnephew, and he's under a sort of obligation of duty, you could say. He says, my knowledge of this thing began in the winter of 1926-27 with the death of my granduncle George Gamel Engel, Professor Emeritus of Semitic Languages in Brown University, Providence, Rhode Island. Professor Engel was widely known as an authority on ancient inscriptions and frequently has been resorted to by the heads of prominent museums, so his passing at the age of 92 may be recalled by many. Locally, interest was intensified by the obscurity of the cause of death. He'd been stricken while returning from the Newport boat, falling suddenly, as witnesses said, only having been jostled by a nautical-looking Negro who'd come from one of the queer dark courts on the precipitous hillside, which formed a shortcut from the waterfront to the deceased's home in William Street. Physicians were unable to find any visible disorder, but concluded, after perplexed debate, some obscure lesion of the heart induced by the brisk ascent of so steep a hill by so elderly a man was responsible for its end. So, kind of mysterious circumstances, which we're going to see talked about a little bit later. And he says, as my granduncle's heir and executor, for he died a childless widower, I was expected to go over his papers with some thoroughness. and for that purpose moved his entire set of files and boxes to my quarters in Boston. And he talks about, most of the material will be published by the American Archaeological Society, but there was one box which I found exceedingly puzzling and which I felt much averse from showing to others' eyes. And that is what the content of the story is, the contents of that box, plus some additional investigations on the part of the grandnephew. So he's reading through, in parts 1 and 2 of the story, Professor Engel's correlations, right? He is starting to put things together. He's getting taken in to the account of Legras and the student and the clippings that have been provided. And then we find, near the end of 2, he says, one thing which I began to suspect, and which I now fear I know, is that my uncle's death was far from natural. He fell on a narrow hill street leading up from an ancient waterfront swarming with foreign mongrels after a careless push from a Negro sailor. I did not forget the mixed blood and marine pursuits of the cult members in Louisiana, and would not be surprised to learn of secret methods and poison needles as ruthless and anciently known as the cryptic rites and beliefs. Legras and his men, it's true, have been left alone, but in Norway a certain seaman who saw things is dead. Might not the deeper inquiries of my uncle after encountering the sculptor's data have come to sinister ears? I think Professor Engel died because he knew too much or because he was likely to learn too much. Whether I shall go as he did remains to be seen, for I have learned much now. Right? So the main character is going beyond Engel's correlations by learning of a further account, one which includes a first-person experience with the being that has so far only been depicted in statues. So he's in a friend's museum, and he says, my eye was caught by an odd picture in one of the old papers spread beneath the stones. It was the Sydney Bulletin I have mentioned, from my friend his wide affiliations in all conceivable foreign parts. And the picture was a half-tone cut of a hideous stone image, almost identical with that which Legras had found in the swamp. So now, another connection to the Cthulhu cult. What's going on here? He investigates. And what he finds is that there's yet more to the story. Now, interestingly, this second mate Johansson, the only survivor of the first pirate attack and then encounter with Cthulhu, he says that Johansson, thank God, did not know quite all, even though he saw the city and the thing. But I who know more, who've correlated more, I shall never sleep calmly again when I think of the horrors that lurk ceaselessly behind life in time and in space, and of those unhallowed blasphemies from elder stars which dream beneath the sea, known and favored by a nightmare cult ready and eager to loose them on the world whenever another earthquake shall heave their monstrous stone city again to the sun and air. So Johansson knew some of the stuff. What he knew probably killed him, certainly affected him. The narrator knows even more. And what we get in the very end of it is quite striking. So he's going to tell us that he's read Johansson's document, right? And he says, I've placed it in the tin box beside the bas relief and the papers of Professor Engel. With it shall go this record of mine. What is the record of mine? The story, the Call of Cthulhu, right? This test of my own sanity, wherein is pieced together that which I hope may never be pieced together again. So we're only privy to this story because of the correlations that have been made within the narrator's mind. But now it's ours as well. The correlations have been transferred onto paper and turned into a story. He goes on and says, I have looked upon all that the universe has to hold of horror, and even the skies of spring and the flowers of summer must ever afterward be poison to me. But I do not think my life will be long. As my uncle went, as poor Johansen went, so shall I go. I know too much, and the cult still lives. And he goes on and says, Cthulhu still lives too, I suppose, in that chasm of stone which has shielded him since the sun was young. And I don't need to go on further with that final paragraph. These are the correlations that have been carried out, set down, and then offered to us in this narrative, this story, the Call of Cthulhu.